Great. Epic. Wow. That's saying something. Are you exhaustipated? Yeah. Well, you had a lot of things in the time away, a lot of compartments. The family, the board meeting, the friends in London, all of that. Yeah. The weird thing about this room, you guys, it's totally open at the top. Like we were going to do this at 6 o'clock, but you could hear all the people in the library, and then, like, it's so bizarre to me that they built this new library with a meeting room that's books. What? Like right on top of my head. And it's like gleaming. It was just kind of crazy. Oh, I thought I was going to get a countdown. I didn't get a countdown. Okay.
Welcome to Buddhism in Action, a monthly event where we sift through some of the tough questions facing our global community. Our speaker is Venerable Tenzin Chogkyi, a Buddhist nun, activist, teacher, and retreat leader. Venerable Tenzin is known for her love of bridging the worlds of Buddhist thought, current affairs, and recent research on positive psychology. And now, Venerable Tenzin.
Great. Thank you all for joining us for our first episode of Buddhism in Action. A new experiment where we're going to combine having a live studio audience with hopefully people signing in from around the world to join us for our conversation. This evening I'm going to be talking about insight that I recently received from studying some positive psychology about kind of some of the thinking behind fundamentalism. And so I wanted to share what I've been discovering through some of my reading. Now, the way that the evening will work, we've got an hour for our episode, and I will first kind of present some of the ideas. We'll do a short contemplation, and then I'll open things up to questions and comments from everybody listening, both the people here with us in the Scotts Valley Library near Santa Cruz, California, and those of you joining us from afar. So we'll, hopefully have time for discussion of whatever comes up. We are going to respect the time agreement of an hour, so we may not have time for everybody's questions necessarily. We'll see how we go. So just to give a little bit of background of how I got interested in this topic, I was couple of years ago doing a training in a system called Cultivating Emotional Balance, which is a merger of Buddhist psychological ideas or Buddhist contemplative practices with Western psychology. And in my investigation of the different emotions from a Western psychological perspective, I learned that grouped under the category of enjoyable emotions is a group of 16 very distinct emotions. And I thought that was interesting. They're grouped together because they have a universal signal, which is the smile for all of these emotions. And so that's what these evolutionary psychologists were looking, what is the sign or what's the signal of these emotions. And when I was reading through these 16, I came across an emotion. The name was coined by a psychologist called Jonathan Haidt, and he called this emotion elevation. And his definition of elevation, he said, elevation is elicited by acts of virtue or moral beauty. It causes warm, open feelings and motivates people to act more virtuously themselves. So I thought this was a really interesting description of an emotion that sounded very much to me like in Buddhist practice we have the four immeasurables, and one of the four immeasurables is empathetic joy. And so we say that's the good feeling that we get when we see someone else doing an act of virtue. It's also a feeling we can get when we act virtuously ourselves. And so it sounded very much like this idea of the emotion of elevation. And I thought, oh, isn't that cool? The Western psychologists have come up with a word for this and really recognized this as a distinct emotion because they were differentiating it from other forms of happiness. They said he said, people often will make a gesture around their heart, like they'll feel some kind of warmth in their heart, like you're seeing someone do a good deed, an act of kindness, and it's this very peaceful feeling. You'll feel some kind of warmth or some kind of sensation in your heart. It leads to a feeling of sort of openness and peace. And so they've researched it quite extensively, this emotion. He was at the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson territory, when he was doing his research on this emotion of elevation. And he was reading some of Thomas Jefferson's letters and found what he thought was a perfect description of this emotion. So I'll read another description by Thomas Jefferson, who said in one of his letters, when any act of charity or of gratitude, for instance, is presented either to our sight or imagination, we are deeply impressed with its beauty and feel a strong desire ourselves of doing charitable and grateful acts also. Now, every emotion of this kind is an exercise of our virtuous dispositions, and dispositions of the mind, like limbs of the body, acquire strength through exercise. So beautiful, I think we could read that and say, oh, Lord Buddha could have said that about the immeasurable of empathetic joy. Very similar kind of explanation of that emotion. So I was intrigued a little bit to read a little bit more about Jonathan Haidt's research, and when I kind of delved into it a little bit more, sort of surprisingly found that he had started studying this emotion of elevation. He'd first started by studying the emotion of disgust. So he and a researcher called Paul Rosen, who's the foremost researcher on the emotion of disgust, and so they were researching disgust. There is a connection, wait for it. So they were researching disgust, and so there's physical disgust, which evolved to, eject, they say, in response to oral incorporation of something poisonous or tainted, right? And they say that the kind of emotion of physical disgust towards something, you eat something that's putrid or rotten or bad. And then there's a facial expression of disgust, which is just like either like that or even like that. Like you're pushing something out with your tongue, right? So there's this physical disgust, and then he started researching social disgust. So there's certain actions that evoke the same kind of disgust response in us, right? For example, certain sexual acts will invoke a response of disgust. Harming someone who's very, very kind. You can think of some of these great leaders that have been shot or harmed in some way, and we have a feeling of disgust towards those people that harm others. For example, the way, we often make that face when somebody says Hitler, the name of Hitler or Mao, you're like, or Stalin, you're like, ugh, right? Because it's somebody who's done something that's seen as degrading or debasing. And so Jonathan Haidt said, oh, it's interesting, there's sort of this axis. And on one end of the axis is actions that are degrading or debasing, and then they evoke a feeling of disgust. We want to kind of be separated from that action it invokes. And then on the other end of the scale are actions that invoke the emotion of elevation in us. And the people that do those kind of actions you want to be closer to, even physically, don't you? You want some connection. And he said, if there was something that belonged to somebody like Hitler, you wouldn't even want to touch it. You'd feel degraded by even the proximity of that thing. I've seen, after one time, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was teaching, and after the event, they were cleaning up the stage where he'd been sitting, and he'd been sitting on a throne, and he had a teacup, and this young Tibetan monk comes up with a plastic bottle, and he kind of looks around, and then he pours His Holiness's tea into a bottle to save, because it was associated with this person who was virtuous and kind. So just like physical disgust, with social disgust, we either want to move away or we want to move towards a person that we see as elevating, right? As somebody who invokes that emotion. So Jonathan Haidt started talking about what he calls these 3 dimensions of social cognition. And so let's look at those. He said that most social psychologists have long accepted 2 dimensions of social cognition or social space. On one axis, the x-axis is closeness or solidarity. So in our social space, our awareness of other people, we have perception of people either being close to us or distant. We have our really good friends, our friends in our family, those are people that are close to us. Then there's the strangers, then there's the people that we don't know very well out there, total strangers. So closeness. And sometimes this is called solidarity because there's a mutual obligation. To people that we're close to, there's a mutual obligation. We will help our friends and family if they need us. Who are you going to call for a ride to the airport? Who are you going to call if your car breaks down? Who are you going to call if you need some kind of help, right? So closeness and solidarity in terms of kind of mutual support. And even in our language, we'll often have different language for the people who are on this part of the axis, close to us, versus this part. Many European languages have 2 forms for the pronoun you. Like in French, tu and vous. In Spanish, tu and usted. For, is that person close to you or not? English doesn't have 2 pronouns for you, but we use other ways of indicating less closeness. The person's last name, Mr. Smith instead of Joe. We'll call somebody by their first name if they're close to us, and maybe use a more formal kind of address for somebody out here. So even in our language, it's reflected. So closeness is one axis. And then this next axis of social cognition is hierarchy or status, right? So where are we in relation to the other person in terms of hierarchy, status, or power? And then Jonathan Haidt says, even societies that despise hierarchy, he says, like egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies and American liberals, he says, still recognize, he said, it takes a lot of work to flatten hierarchy. He says egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, it always starts manifesting and it takes a lot of work to flatten. So he said even societies that aren't into it acknowledge that it's there. Some societies, for example, he talks about Indian culture, Hindu culture with all the caste system, incredible hierarchy, right? Built into the culture incredibly. Also, I was talking to an elderly Japanese Zen master the other day, and he was insisting that I call him by his first name, but he was an elder and a master, and I'm kind of insisting to call him Tanahashi Sensei, and he's like, no, call me Kaz, and I'm like, I just can't. I can't, you know? And even though I'm an American, I've been so trained in respectful hierarchical language because of being in the Buddhist Asian world for so long. I just couldn't bring myself to do that. And you know, when somebody, you know, who has a higher status than you and they kind of insist you call them by their first name, and it doesn't quite feel right. So even for us, you know, we do recognize hierarchy. And then I said to him, I said, isn't it true in Japan there's 7 different levels of status in the language, like 7 different pronouns and verb forms, so that when you meet someone, they hand you their business card and you hand them yours and you're looking at it and figuring out how low to bow. And do you bow lower than them? And he's like, yeah, but pfft. He's like, forget about that. So many cultures, it's very built in, or at least kind of a respect for elders. Right? And in a lot of American cultures, North American culture, I was just living in Canada with a lot of native culture, respect for the elders is like this huge thing, right? So there's this status or hierarchy in terms of respect for elders. So it always exists in some form or another, you know, even if we want to flatten it a bit. So social psychologists have long acknowledge these 2 axes. And then what Jonathan Haidt says is there's a third axis. There's the vertical axis, the z-axis, and that's what he calls the axis of divinity or elevation. When you're perceiving other people, social cognition or social space, where are they in terms of, are they somebody that being around them is going to be degrading and somehow debasing to you? Or are they going to be uplifting? Even our very language, elevation. Oh, I was so uplifted by seeing what that person did. Or they just brought me down. I mean, we even use it in our language for this z-axis of elevation. And he said, thinking of our social space in 3 dimensions, with this z-axis as being kind of part of the way that we relate to other people. And being conscious of it, right? Because often unconsciously we seek out people and events that will uplift us. I mean, I was thinking about it in terms of the Facebook feed, you know, the Greater Good Network and Upworthy and all these things that you love to watch. Like if you're in a bad mood, you go on your Facebook feed and somebody saved the dog that was down in the bottom of the well, and you watch this 5-minute thing. And that's the emotion that you're feeling, is elevation. When you see something like that, you feel like, oh, wow, that's awesome. You know, seeing other people do acts of kindness, especially unexpected, you know, because Jonathan Haidt says the elevation is even more if it's sort of unexpected. Like I saw this thing of the bus driver who's driving across the bridge and the woman on the other side of the barrier looked like she was going to jump. He just stopped the bus, made everybody wait, talked to this woman for 20 minutes to get her back over the barrier. And everybody in the bus, he gets back on the bus and everybody cheers. They don't mind that they've waited 20 minutes because he's like, you know, that kind of stuff, we love to see that. And then these things that are debasing and degrading, we try and avoid, you know, because it's sort of on the upper end of the axis is this elevation, and then on the bottom kind of end of the axis is kind of degrading and debasing behavior. So it's just another way that we sort of relate to the world. So I want to lead us through a little contemplation on the emotion of elevation, and then we'll kind of turn around and just relate it to the topic of this evening, this idea of kind of religious fundamentalism. But first I just wanted, before we do the meditation, to see if there's any comments or questions or anything to clarify or just any reflections, because this might be new information. I just found it really interesting to look at these three axes, and like I said, we mostly think about the X and Y one without maybe seeing that it's, two different ways of relating. Oh, and by the way, in the language too, for the familiar form we use for children, for example, in European languages. Somebody who's lower in status, either someone who's closer to us or someone who's lower in status, it reflects in our language too. Any questions or comments or on just that piece so far? Yeah, Steve. Oh, could you wait for the mic? We're going to make sure everything's...
The divinity axis, I'm just curious on the dynamics of the chart. Is that supposed to be 90 degrees to the other?
Yes, yeah. So it's kind of like up. So it would be
it's
X,
not
Y, and...
45.
Yeah. It's just hard to draw 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional paper, but it's meant to be up.
Divinity in that sense, and the three axes,
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a way to relate it to the space, dimension of receding into the distance as opposed to up and, right and left.
Yeah, it's sort of like,
right and left.
here's where we are, and then it's sort of relating people either closeness to us, where are they in terms of hierarchy, or then, how do they affect us, or just, I think, social cognition, like we're placing people along those axes in relation to us or their effect on us. Divinity, I'm not crazy about the word divinity, and he makes it very clear that it has nothing to do with God necessarily, although in a lot of religious traditions, in fact, he mentions a quote by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that talks about exactly this axis and says human beings are between the beasts and the angels, and then we're either moving towards the angels or down towards the beasts on the basis of our moral behavior. So it's kind of an interesting thing, and it's almost everybody who refers to it, it's like this up and down thing. So he kind of describes it as that vertical axis of up and down. Yeah. Any other questions before we, I want to just do a short contemplation where I want you to just kind of get in touch with this emotion of elevation, maybe thinking of things in your own life that might invoke it, and then we'll look at some interesting things that Jonathan Haidt says about its relationship, this kind of spiritual dimension and how it relates to our social conditions. So let's just take a moment. I'll just guide you through, prompt you with some things to think about in terms of this emotion of elevation. But let's just sit for a minute and just watch the breath, settle the mind for just a minute with the breath. And so take a moment and just draw from your memory. Is there a time that you experienced the emotion of elevation after witnessing something that someone else did? And if you can think of a time where you felt elevation, what was the cause of that emotion? What was the incident or the episode that happened? And how did it make you feel? Can you remember what you felt in your body, the sensations in your body? Try and re-trigger that emotion with your memory of that experience. And then think, did that feeling of elevation inspire you to act in any way? And were there any lasting effects of this emotion? And draw from your memory again. Is there a time that you felt this emotion because of some kind action that you've done? Maybe it wasn't just witnessing someone else doing an act of kindness, perhaps unexpected, but perhaps you did something very kind, really helped someone, went out of your way. Is there a time that your own actions brought about this feeling of elevation, that heart-warmed, inspired feeling? Draw from your memory. And can you imagine any activities, whether they be interactions or rituals or anything else that would help you move up on this axis of divinity in your life? Anything that you feel could help you move up, feel more of that emotion of elevation. what would be the effects of becoming conscious of this dimension and really prioritizing it in your life? So we've got a question or comment. Yes.
Andy Cantor writes, it seems like the three axes are different forms of relatedness. Closeness is a family personal connection, hierarchy is a social societal relatedness, and divinity is a religious or relatedness on a spiritual level.
Yeah. I think that's definitely true. You know, it comes through spirituality, but it also is the way we relate to each other too. Even though in, you know, maybe sort of modern American society, things are a little bit flattened in terms of that third dimension. But when we think about, you know, the people that inspire us, that is a part of how we relate to other people too. Are they uplifting to be around, or being around them, do we feel degraded? But it really does kind of relate to this sort of axis of, you know, moving up towards the more pure or spiritual. One of the things that Jonathan Haidt did a lot of research in India, and especially in Hindu culture, I think more than any other, also in Jewish culture, there's a lot of rules about pollution and purity, right? So a lot of the rules are built into the religion about whether or not you're moving up or down this axis. For example, the laws of Manu, these laws in Hinduism, I think this is about the 2nd century BCE, that were encoded, incredible rules about what you would do that would pollute you and kind of move you down that axis, or, you know, things about ritual purity. So in cultures like that, it's also very relational. It's about your relationship with the divine, but it's also about how you're perceived by your culture and how you move up and down on that axis. So yeah, very relational in many cultures where they have a lot of emphasis on those laws about purity and pollution. And that was sort of Jonathan Haidt's insight when he was studying social disgust and then started studying these laws. And then he said, well, what's the opposite of that? You know, we're studying these things that you should avoid so as not to be polluted. You know, and he was talking about being in these Hindu temples in India, and how as a non-Hindu, he couldn't even go in past the outer courtyard because it would pollute. You know, it wasn't about secrecy, it's just that his presence would pollute the inner sanctum. And so, you know, a lot of cultures have that built in that very much sort of regulates social interaction as well. So both, I think. Yeah, good. Any reflections from that contemplation, just that brief, anything that makes elevation happen for you? Marilyn, yeah.
I was thinking about the interconnection of these three, and also relational, about how that affects my relationships with my ex, how that closeness or the hierarchy affects that.
Yeah.
And and then I was, I was just taking it really close internally, the subtle differences, and then kind of going out like, oh my gosh, what happens when whatever religion you are, you meet someone from a different religion.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that too, like when, your own ideas of moving up and down the axis don't coincide with someone else's ideas about how to move up and down the axis. Francesca has something too, yeah.
Oh, it just suddenly occurred to me how much stronger the y and the x-axis become if you perceive an elevation coming from that person. If it's a spouse who is bringing you to a higher and higher state as opposed to a degraded state, the extra power in that. Or if you see a person high in the hierarchy who has overtones of true goodness, how, rocket propelled boost you get from seeing that. And in fact, that may lead to a certain danger because people get so
interesting.
intensely projecting that on the person.
Right. So it's sort of Z plus either X or Y is sort of exponential.
It could add to the other two.
I think there could be a whole like spherical model that would be really interesting. That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that at all, about like if the divinity axis adds to the X or the Y, what a potent combination that would be to have someone who is sort of on the extreme of all of those axes. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, like somebody you have tremendous respect who you also think is like all the way out there on the Z axis, and what a powerful figure someone like that would be. Yeah, Steve.
So, in thinking about it, it seems the center, the cross is the self, and the further out you go is other, and the z-axis is your sort of depth of field, and inclusive or exclusive, and the more inclusive is the more inspiring, and the exclusive, being defiled or whatever, feeling separate from whatever community.
Yeah, right.
Just
because of course in a lot of cultures, if you defy certain taboos, then you are expelled, shunned, sent into exile, whatever. So it's true. I mean, there is that thing of like you can go, beyond the pale, quite literally, of doing something that causes you to be expelled from community. And of course, that's just so fraught for human beings. It's a question of survival.
And that's why the refuge in the Sangha being so inclusive.
And that just kind of strengthens the elevation muscles a little bit. Is there another question? Okay. So now imagine that you live in a very rich three-dimensional culture.
It's such a blessing too to be able to
honors
and you just feel them.
Yes.
Like right there, like, what is
Open
that?
the door.
Exactly. Exactly.
Children.
So I guess this is the first one I've done.
Yeah, so this is a
Almsgiving
podcast
is a
thing
huge
you're doing.
part of the culture, for example, generosity, community, you know, praying many times a day to get that sense of elevation. And then suddenly there's a cultural shift, and ideas like capitalism and greed and consumerism start to come in. You notice that your children and your grandchildren don't have the same values that you do, that you feel is what makes life and your culture really rich. And all of these ideas that seem to be tainting your culture are coming from the outside, you know, are invading. And you're almost feeling like a sense of panic because you feel these three dimensions being flattened into two, you know, which to you makes it feel like life is hardly worth living anymore. You know, how would that feel? Interesting, isn't it, to think about, you know, the flattening of the three dimensions into two for someone for whom the third dimension is such an important part of their life. And thinking about the Islamic, you know, kind of rebellion against Western culture and values. When you come from a traditional Muslim culture where all of these things are valued that are now being, you know, the young children aren't, you know, following the same values anymore because of this kind of invasion from the West, and how does that feel? And so Jonathan Haidt relates this third dimension to fundamentalism, and I just wanted to read what he says because it's just so kind of clear what he says. He says in the chapter, and this book is called The Happiness Hypothesis. This is his first book. He says this chapter on elevation is about the ancient truth that devoutly religious people grasp and that secular thinkers often do not, that by our actions and our thoughts we move up and down on a vertical dimension. And then he says, an implication of this truth is that we are impoverished as human beings when we lose sight of this dimension and let our world collapse into two dimensions. But at the other extreme, the effort to create a three-dimensional society and impose it on all residents is the hallmark of religious fundamentalism. Fundamentalists, whether Christian, Jewish, Hindu, or Muslim, or Buddhist, want to live in nations whose laws are in harmony with or are taken from a particular holy book. There are many reasons for democratic Western societies to oppose such fundamentalism, but I believe that the first step in such opposition must be an honest and respectful understanding of its moral motives. So interesting, isn't it? Because I think, you know, we all know how divisive our world is. I mean, just our own presidential election could not be more polarized and divisive. And it just feels like things are getting more and more divided along the lines of the right and the left, are getting so much more extreme. But in order to heal and in order to have dialogue, we need to have some compassion. And in order to have compassion, we need to have some kind of empathy, which depends on a perspective taking. Sometimes when we talk about empathy, we talk about affective empathy, actually feeling the feelings of the other. And then we talk about cognitive empathy, which is perspective taking. Sometimes we can feel both, but sometimes it's just the cognitive empathy of like, oh, I get that third dimension and how important that is. Oh, I understand a little bit more now about what's driving someone. I may not at all agree with the methods. I don't agree that others should impose their idea of the third dimension onto everyone else. But I see that life is richer with that third dimension. That I can understand. That I can understand. Interesting timing. I was reading this work by Jonathan Haidt last year studying, kind of investigating a little bit, and I decided to talk about this emotion of elevation. One Sunday morning class when I lived at the center in Canada, every Sunday morning I'd have a class, very general interest drop-in. So I'd prepared this talk, and then the bombings in Paris happened that Friday. So I go, well, okay, this is pretty appropriate topic. So that morning, the people were coming in for the Sunday morning talk, and one of the students who, very kind woman, sweet person, she was a good friend, she came in and she just said, I am so angry. I am so angry. I just want to bomb. She was just completely distraught. She was just like, I would just want to drop bombs right now. And she looked at me and she just goes, you don't feel that way, do you? And I go, no, I don't. And I think something I have to say today might help. And I kind of presented this whole idea of the third dimension and how people can think, oh, I want the third dimension to exist, and it looks like this, and it goes along with the rules of my holy books, and this is what it has to look like. But to get the empathy of going, yeah, I want a three-dimensional world too. I want elevation too. I want it in my own life. I want it around. But it's a different viewpoint of like, I want everybody to figure out what it is for them and be free to do that versus saying, oh, it looks like this and everybody has to do it my way. But it's a basic human need. Jonathan Haidt also says the third dimension is found in all human cultures. No matter what religion you ascribe to, there's something, that's moving you up and down that third axis. So if we can find that common ground and have that empathy, even towards someone whose methods we completely disagree with, then maybe there's a little bit of a chance for some compassion and for some dialogue. When you say, oh, I don't understand that at all, they're just nuts, then there's nowhere to go with that kind of an idea. So I just thought to share this idea, with you all, because it really helped me. And when we were talking about it, the weekend after the Paris bombing, it was quite amazing because people's feelings, there was just a little bit the toe in the door. Jonathan Haidt also quotes the historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, and he says, Eliade says, the modern West is the first culture in human history that has managed to strip time and space of all sacredness and to produce a fully practical, efficient, and profane world. This is the world that religious fundamentalists find unbearable and are sometimes willing to use force to fight against. So interesting, to think about the reaction to some of these, the stripping of the third dimension and the flattening of our world and our culture. So now we've got a little bit of time before we end. We've got about 10 minutes or so for any comments or questions that you might have, any discussion. Yeah, Steve, somebody's...
Danny, online.
Hi, Danny.
Just down the road, actually. She asks, are these three dimensions mutually exclusive, or do you often see changes in position on one axis affect the other?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I mean, I think what Francesca said before, how she feels like the z-axis can accentuate the x-axis and the y-axis. That would be an interesting thing to look at, like how, I think that could definitely be true. And then the closeness and hierarchy, I think, are also related because if there's somebody who's, far away from us in hierarchy, we usually don't feel so intimate with that person either, right? So they're in a different social class, let's say. So I think there is a lot of interrelationship between those three. That's an interesting question. It would be worth just thinking about and kind of mulling over how do these three relate to each other. That would be an interesting investigation too. But I would say so. Francesca's got a comment about that.
I was just thinking other ways when you're talking about fundamentalism and terrorism. Surely the emotions of a terrorist are very complex, but they must also involve the loss of closeness and solidarity with people they know who have been killed, and the loss of hierarchy, the loss of status or power in their own society. And if you then combine that with a sense of great loss of elevation, then you've got an extra powered emotion that feels very self-righteous as these acts are undertaken.
And you feel like the fabric of your society is just coming undone. On all three axes, it's sort of like there's nothing to lose. It's just anarchy. It's all falling apart. You know, you could see how that would provoke extreme reactions. We've got
You know, what you were just talking about with some of the terrorism or the fundamentalism, you were talking about maybe the loss of the elevation or the hierarchy. But it seems also that that's used with younger people as they haven't necessarily lost it, but they want to gain it. And because those things are valued so highly in their cultures, that they're trying to find extreme ways of gaining status and you know, elevation, because they're told that they're going to gain these things by these extreme acts. And so I wonder how much that the loss and the desire to gain it back again, or to gain something that you don't have or you've never had. Also
interesting. When you said that, it just reminded me, and I hadn't thought about this before, about like my hippie generation, you know, the hippies of the 60s and early 70s, and how it was such a reaction towards the ultra-materialism of our post-war parents, like with the baby boomers, really reacting to the flattening. And what did we do? We went off and meditated with Ram Dass and joined communes, and, you know, we were actually rejecting materialism and seeking some sort of third access on our own terms, but it was a rejection to what a lot of the young people in these countries where things, you know, it's a human need that we can all relate to. Like, we want that kind of elevation. We want something uplifting in our lives, and we're just going to create it somehow. If it's not there for us, like all of us did with Woodstock and communes and everything else, you know, we're going to create it somehow if it's lacking in our culture. So that's easy to relate to.
Hi, Venerable.
Hi, RJ. How's it going?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
How, as a society, how much tolerance do you think we should accept from fundamentalist ideology? Is it something that we
tolerance for?
Yeah, should we tolerate it as a whole, or is it something we should kind of be careful?
You know, I think, again, in order to have any kind of meaningful dialogue, we have to have empathy, which comes from some kind of understanding, you know, and compassion. It's interesting because Jonathan Haidt wrote this book in 2006, so quite a while ago. And he talks in this book about the difference between the religious Christian right and Christian left. And so he says, in the Christian left, tolerance and acceptance are a spiritual value. So our elevation comes from being tolerant and accepting. So he says on the Christian right, there's more of an idea of the z-axis has to look my way or the highway. Whereas in the Christian left, he's saying that tolerance and acceptance are such a huge part of spiritual values that, you know, actually, you know, make us elevated. I'll read another quote by him, because in the conclusion to this chapter, he really kind of, I think, addresses your question. He says, and this is just Jonathan Haidt's own words, as a liberal, I value tolerance and openness to new ideas. He says, I've done my best in this chapter to be tolerant towards those whose politics I oppose, and to find merit in religious ideas I do not hold. But although I have begun to see the richness that divinity adds to human experience, I do not entirely lament the flattening of life in the West over the last few hundred years. An unfortunate tendency of three-dimensional societies is that they often include one or more groups that get pushed down on the third dimension and then treated badly or worse. He says, look at the conditions of untouchables in India until recently, or at the plight of Jews in medieval Europe, and in purity-obsessed Nazi Germany, or at the humiliation of African Americans in the segregated South. The American religious right now seems to be trying to push homosexuals down in a similar way. Liberalism and the ethic of autonomy are great protectors against such injustices. I believe it's dangerous for the ethic of divinity to supersede the ethic of autonomy in the governance of a diverse modern democracy. Right? So it's sort of like weighing those two things. He says, however, I also believe that life in a society that entirely ignores the ethic of divinity would be ugly and unsatisfying. So if we live in a culture that's very diverse, you know, with diverse religions, with diverse ethnicities, it's dangerous to allow anyone's idea of the axis of divinity to supersede, you know, that kind of tolerance and that kind of autonomy. But as he says, you know, some balance there, to have that axis there, but not to allow, you know, any one group's version of it to impose on everyone else, you know. And I love the way he sort of summarizes by saying, yeah, it's important, but actually I can't completely, you know, bemoan the flattening when it leads to oppression of people who don't fit in to that paradigm. Yeah. Yes?
We've had some questions online about the title of the book to which you're referring. Would you mind just
Yes.
sharing that with us again?
The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt, and you spell his last name Haidt, The Happiness Hypothesis. He's also written another book, and the title I've forgotten right now, kind of, what's that? The Righteous Mind, thank you. Kind of more specifically on this topic. But yeah, and then there's a lot of his work also online, a lot of his research papers and things online. Yeah. Anything else? Yes?
Do you have any thoughts about how more elevation can be brought back into our global culture?
Yeah. Well, I think consciousness of it, prioritizing it. I think, you know, interfaith dialogue, these events that we can have with each other where we really understand. I mean, we're having, you know, we're starting to have these events at Vajrapani. His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, as Fabienne read in one of the books, that a real understanding of each other's religious traditions and a positive experience with each other's practices, I think that will enter the dimension in without the danger of, you know, my way is the right way. And I think there's you know, there's big movements for these kind of interfaith dialogues and interreligious dialogues. We don't have to be afraid of sharing our axis of divinity with others, because sometimes also we're like, oh, that person believes something else, so I can't even talk about it at all. We'll just pretend it doesn't exist. Whereas I think really sharing with each other what, you know, what moves you up the axis. We all have our own very unique ways, and for some of us it's our spiritual traditions or our religious traditions, our different rituals. And so I think like really sharing them and not being shy about it, despite our profane secular culture, you know, in America, not being shy about it, and really just having it be part of the dialogue and really feeling the acceptance of, you know, other people's practices as well. But I think what His Holiness said, having positive experiences with each other's practices, which is what so many of these interfaith gatherings about, is a huge start in that direction of, you know, entering in the third dimension without without intolerance, you know, with tolerance and acceptance, which to me is a huge spiritual value also. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. That was great for our debut session. What I'd like to talk about our next episode, the third week of June, which is it June 15th? June 15th, same time, same place. I've been doing some reading about, well, in the Buddhist tradition, there's a lot of emphasis on our perception creating our reality, right? And so those of you that have studied Buddhist ideas, our perception creates our reality. We have a certain shorthand. We perceive through, you know, kind of concepts. Human beings also have a lot of perception that is triggered by certain symbols. But then sometimes this can lead to things like stereotypes and discrimination, which is also a big problem that we're having in our culture right now. So I want to kind of bring together the Buddhist ideas about perception and how we see the world with some of the more problematic areas about how it can go haywire. So that's what we're going to be talking about next month. So those of you that are in the studio audience are welcome to join us again. And those of you that are signing in from afar, thank you very much for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you to everyone for participating in Buddhism in Action. We hope it has brought you some fresh perspectives and greater clarity, and we provide deep thanks, offer deep thanks for Venerable Tenzin's teachings tonight. Buddhism in Action takes place from 7 to 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, the third Wednesday of every month. If you found tonight's show helpful, please spread the word. Also, we welcome your topic suggestions for future episodes, and you can leave those suggestions at the web address that you see on the screen, buddhisminaction.org, or email to moderator@buddhisminaction.org. Thank you, everyone.